The question I'd like to start with today is, how well equipped are you to understand young China? When I say young China, I actually mean two things. On one hand, we of course have young people. I'm an American millennial. Everyone's sort of obsessed with who we are, what we stand for, what we want to buy, who are we going to vote for, are we going to vote at all, what are we loyal to, have we ever been loyal to anything? There's about 80 million of us. There are 417 million millennials in China. 5 times more than what we have in the United States. There's actually more young people in China than there are people in the United States and Canada combined. It's young China number one. The second definition of young China, and I think this one's more interesting actually, is a sort of old culture, an old idea of what it means to be Chinese, most recently driven by poverty and frankly, communism, redefining its identity on the world stage today. And this young generation, they're the pathfinders for the future of China, for young China, for the identity of China that we're going to be seeing in the next 5 to 10 years. So when we ask ourselves, how well equipped are you to understand young China, the answer I find is not very. We have a lot of discussions about the trade deficit right now. What I think, and my first point here, is we have to start discussing the understanding deficit. How many people here can tell me who China's most popular singer is? And if you don't think that's important, how important were the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix to your sense of self growing up? The second point I'd like to talk about is China's speed and generation goals. I'm often asked, what's the most distinct characteristic of this young generation in China? And this one really comes to mind first. And for those of you who can't see in back, I'm going to explain what this is. This is a graph of the per capita GDP change, the amount of times it's increased since 1990. So I was born in 1990 in California, and in my lifetime, I've watched our per capita GDP, so not a perfect measure, but a basic unit for what a life gets you in a place. I've watched it increase 2.5 times in my lifetime. So maybe the education my parents could provide for me, 2.5 times better. The cars my neighbors drove, 2.5 times faster. The trips we could take, 2.5 times longer. You kind of get the gist. My friends in China born in the exact same year have watched their per capita GDP increase 27 times in their lifetime. Maybe it's just a developing country thing. What about India? Massive economy, education oriented. 5. Germany, robust economy, 1.9. Brazil, BRICS country, 3.2. In fact, when you look at the top 60 performing economies of today, you'll notice a trend. When people ask me what China's speed is, I point to this graph. You guys can see here that pretty much everywhere else in the world moves at a certain pace since 1990. The amount of change, the amount of growth that millennials across the world have witnessed in their lifetime is more or less the same. It's the single digits. And if you're wondering what China's speed looks like, if you're wondering what it takes to keep up with China, and particularly this young generation, this is China right here. And so people ask me, what's the most astonishing thing about this young generation? It's the amount of change they've witnessed in their lifetime. It's the greatest rags to riches story in the history of modern economics. When we imagine it, by the way, it's a mistake to imagine it as a government-led macroeconomic pull. You should be thinking about the people. In 1990, this is what Shanghai looked like. This is what Shanghai looks like today. What would that do to the way you've seen the world, the way you see the world? And so we talk a lot about generation gaps in the United States. What are boomers like? What are millennials like? God, we're so different. Anyone who ever had to market to them, and you probably are tired of hearing about this. This was the United States in 1969. This is the Woodstock Festival. This is the United States last year. This is Coachella. I mean, they're different, but let's be honest with ourselves for a second. They're not that different. This is China in 1969, mired in deep poverty during the Cultural Revolution. This is China today. The rest of the world has generation gaps. Because of the pace of change in China, China is the one nation in the world that truly has generation gulfs. And the last point, I'm going to make this one quick, is the idea of Easternization. If you guys were to open up your Microsoft Word and type in Westernization, they'd capitalize the W for you. It's an idea we have in our heads. If you were to write Easternization, you'd get the red squiggly lines underneath. Error. It's not a concept in our vocabulary. And so there's something that I run into often, particularly in business communities, that I refer to as the Shanghai fallacy. The Shanghai fallacy is a business executive or someone on a tour or even just visiting China, spends a week in China. They go to Shanghai, they have an incredible tour guide who has spent most of their life immersing themselves, changing their mental diet particularly with foreign and English material, just so they could have that conversation with you. You have a beautiful steak, a great glass of wine, you're looking at the bund, you read the brands that you recognize, you ignore the ones you can't, and you go home thinking that for China, modernization means westernization. What's interesting, and Yang Lang just brought this up, is that this is the first generation, really, of an Eastern power, but in China, that has both the economic and political consequence, as well as the strong sense of self, the cultural identity, that means they're going to have enough cultural gravity to perhaps start to change the way that our world spins. And so what does this look like going forward? What's the combination of Easternization and Westernization? Because that new identity is being formed right now in China. So again, the question I'd like to leave you all with before we begin our discussion is, how well equipped are you to understand young China? Because it's likely going to be a big portion of what defines the future of our world. Thank you.